Because it's one thing to train yourself to not think in terms of cognitive distortions. It's one thing to work on your trauma, but in and of itself, in many cases, is still not enough. Welcome back to my series on depression. In our previous videos, we looked at how depression wasn't the result of a chemical imbalance in the brain and how that theory was more so drummed up by pharmaceutical companies to sell as antidepressants. Now we are exploring, using the biopsychosocial model, what some of the risk factors for depression are. In the last video, we looked at the biological risk factors of depression, and today we're going to look at the psychological risk factors of depression. But first, if you're new here, please consider subscribing because I make videos like this at least once a week, and especially now that we're talking about a topic like this, I am feeling so antsy to sort of get through the meat, to get through the vegetables of this discussion so that we can get into more spiritual topics shortly after. The first psychological risk factor for depression that I have identified in my research is negative patterns of thinking. This is a cornerstone of cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea that your thoughts affect your feelings, which affect your behaviors in a multi-directional feedback loop. The technical term for negative thought patterns is cognitive distortions. These are exaggerated and irrational thought patterns that skew a person's sense of reality and lead to unnecessary emotional distress. Some examples of cognitive distortions include catastrophizing an incident, drawing it out to its worst logical conclusion, thinking black and white, and mind reading, i.e., believing that you know what another person is thinking when really, at best, you are speculating and making assumptions, which are often the worst assumptions, and you know, you get the drift. So you can imagine these patterns aren't helpful when it comes to emotional self-regulation. If you are already experiencing distress from a stressor, you don't need to be adding to that distress by creating more suffering for yourself via faulty thought patterns. This is the difference between being in pain and suffering. Being in pain is understandable. Being in pain is a natural response to certain events in our lives. But suffering, theoretically, is man-made. Suffering is the pain that you create for yourself as a result of your interpretation of your existing pain. Does that make sense? I made a video about cognitive distortions, which you can watch if you haven't already. It's going to be in a link in the description box below. The second psychological risk factor for depression is trauma. Trauma can take on many forms, from childhood abuse to sexual assault to being a witness to violence in your community or in war. In psychological terms, however, trauma is an emotional response to a deeply distressing experience, one in which you believed you were in danger of being seriously harmed or losing your life. Trauma carries long-lasting physical and emotional consequences, as we know. Post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, affects 5 to 10% of the general population. People who have a history of trauma, particularly childhood trauma, are at a higher risk of developing a whole host of medical conditions, from cardiovascular issues to cancer to, you guessed it, psychiatric conditions like depression, anxiety. According to Andrea Roberts, a research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, quote, "When you experience something anxiety-provoking, your stress response activates. Your body produces more adrenaline, your heart races, and your body primes itself to react. Someone who has experienced trauma may have stronger surges of adrenaline and experience them more often than somebody who has not had the same history. This causes wear and tear on the body, just as it would in a car where the engine was constantly revving and racing." In the same article, Andrea also talks about the link between chronic stress and inflammation. And if you will recall from the last video, we talked about the link between inflammation, chronic inflammation, and symptoms of depression. And it's really, really intriguing. And if you haven't watched that last video, again, I would encourage you to watch that. It's going to make it all make sense. The third psychological risk factor for depression is chronic stress. I'm going to go back to a quote from Andrea. "Chronic stress can increase inflammation in the body, and inflammation has been associated with a broad range of illnesses. Early trauma disrupts the inflammatory system. This can lead to long-term aberrations in this system and chronic health problems triggered by constant inflammation. Typically, the more trauma you've experienced, the worse your health is." So that's a really interesting piece here. Something that I've long believed, that if your body constantly believes that it is under attack, you're going to be more hypervigilant, and then fewer resources are going to be dedicated to, you know, other bodily functions such as staying calm. And yes, from the way that I described it, it's very, much in layman's terms, but if you look at the research, it seems to be the case. There is your parasympathetic nervous system, and then there's your sympathetic nervous system, and when one gets activated, the other isn't at play. To be honest, guys, at the point of filming right now, I do feel a little stressed and tired from making videos like this. Not because I'm not interested in talking about depression. I could talk about depression until the cows come home. But on a very personal, anecdotal level, I do notice that when I am constantly under stress, at some point, lo and behold, the symptoms of depression come back. But I don't want to make it seem like, this is the reason why I wanted to break up this series into biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors, because it's one thing to train yourself to not think in terms of cognitive distortions. It's one thing to work on your trauma, but in and of itself, in many cases, is still not enough, because there's so much more to preventing depression than just making sure you are doing everything right for yourself, for your emotional health, for your mental health, etc. You can get all of those things right, but if you live in a society that doesn't promote the values that encourage connectedness and community, that also has something to do with how likely you are to become depressed. And that's a little sneak peek, because in our next video, we're going to talk about the social risk factors for depression. And after that, we're going to talk about the spiritual risk factors for depression. I hope you'll join me for those next two videos. I believe that's where things are going to get a little bit more spicy. As somebody who has a social sciences background, I'm really excited about those next two videos. And lastly, super grateful to you guys for making it this far, for being with me, for eating the broccoli with me. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and leave a comment down below, and I will see you very shortly in my next video.